What's going on, everyone? Dudette with Dudette Gaming here, back with another Predecessor video. Today we're going to be taking a look at some helpful tips on how to catch up when you have fallen behind in lane. We're also going to be taking some basic looks at how to properly counter build your enemy so that you can get the advantage on them. So let's get into it. Falling behind is something that happens to absolutely everybody in Predecessor. It doesn't matter how good you are, at some point or another it happens. We all have bad games. What is important is that you learn how to properly come back and catch up to your opponent when you've fallen behind, and it's also important to know how to properly deal with difficult situations. The reality is you'll never be a good Predecessor player if you can't fight through all of the adversity that you go through. So let's take a look at some helpful tips on how you can catch up to your opponent when you've started falling behind. The first tip that I want to leave you with is freezing the lane. Freezing the lane is an extremely helpful skill that you can learn in Predecessor. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, in its most basic sense, is instead of always attacking the minions and trying to push them as hard as you can, you learn to freeze them in place. Now, this isn't some special ability or card that you use. This is a technique. And as I said, in its most basic essence, all you want to do is last hit only. When that yellow bar becomes a little red bar, that is the only time you want to attack the minions. And you want to avoid, if you're a melee character, you want to avoid overswinging or hitting multiple enemies at the same time. By last hitting only, you gain control of the minions that are fighting each other. You gain control of them. And when you've gained control, you can sort of control where it is in the lane that they're fighting. So if you pay enough attention and you're patient enough, you can actually control them to the point where they're sitting in front of your tower and their progression towards the enemy tower is extremely slow. What this does is it both forces the enemy to either come close to you and close to your tower if they want to get some farm, or it forces them to stay far enough back because they're worried about getting ganked or anything happening to them that they don't want. This is a huge advantage that you can gain on your enemy. And if you can learn how to really properly freeze the lane and then push it at optimal times, you can get a huge advantage because you will get the last hits and you can help prevent your opponent from getting the last hits. Now, what I just brought up was pushing at the right time. There are times where you do want to push that lane so that it hits the enemy's tower, but you really want to be patient and make sure you're doing this at a good time. For example, if you need to back and you notice the enemy laner isn't in your lane, that can be a really good opportunity to push through the minions. So kill them as fast as you can so that they go and attack the enemy tower and then potentially reset. So the minions are reset to the center again. You don't want to leave lane with the minions close to your tower because now the enemy has a lot more opportunity to push your minions into your tower. So make sure before you leave to go buy new cards or gank another lane, you push your minions into the enemy tower. This will give you a big advantage on the enemy, and it will force them, if for example you're going to help gank another lane, it will force them to go protect their tower opposed to helping come in, say, a team fight. Okay. Here's another one that I want to leave you guys with, and that is respecting the enemy's ability. Both the player you're playing against and the hero that they're playing. For example, let's say you're playing in the off lane and you're playing against a Sevarog. A really good Sevarog player, even some moderate and basic Sevarog players, are able to use the kit that he has to decimate you. His ultimate ability is able to knock you back a very far different distance. He has a root that can hold you in place. He has the siphon, and he has an ability to quickly move up the lane. And if a good Sevarog is against you, he can burn his kit real fast and burn you down. This is a big disadvantage for you if you've fallen behind, because he's going to do a lot more damage than you. He's going to be able to control you so you can't do a lot of damage to him while he's using his abilities correctly. And you're not going to be able to do any damage even if you try because he's ahead. So you need to respect your enemy. Respect the player who's playing them. Realize if they're maybe a better player than you, or at least in this moment they're playing better. And respect the hero they're playing and the abilities they have. This may mean that you lose out on some last hits on minions. It may mean that you have to wait for him to push the minions towards you. And that's okay, because that gives you that opportunity to control the lane and to freeze the minions. So make sure you respect the enemy you're playing, because they could gain even more advantage on you if they just keep killing you over and over. Now, another little part of that I want to leave is that you are patient with, for example, your jungler or other laners that may come to help. Be patient. Encourage them to come help you if you're falling behind. Put it up in the text chat or ping that you need help. And if they come, help them get the kill on the enemy, or help them help you take out the enemy tower. So many people will get all upset in game and they'll rage because they need help. And then they ask for help. And when the help finally arrives, the person asking for it's nowhere to be found. So make sure you're paying attention. If you're going to ask for help, watch to see if your team is coming to help. Another really small but helpful tip that you can do is remember to hurt or poke the enemy when you have the opportunity. When you have the opportunity to do little bits of damage over time to your enemy, you force them to not be at full health at all times. This is really helpful if your team, for whatever reason, let's say your jungler is not one who seems to come and help a lot. If you've been poking your opponent in lane and their health is constantly at half, that's way more encouraging for your team to come and help, because now they're seeing this hero who's getting far ahead is actually a little bit vulnerable. Now, this is a little more difficult if you're a melee character and you want to be careful, because you can actually end up in a bad situation if you're not respecting your enemy's ability. So if you're going to poke them, make sure you're strategic. Attack and back off if you have to. Attack and then back off. Try not to engage a fight, because if you're behind, you're probably going to lose. But if you can do those bits of damage without taking damage, or at least as much damage as you're doing, you can gain an advantage on them. Okay, so those are just some small helpful tips on how to catch up. There are plenty of ways in Pred that you can catch up, and patience is probably the best one. Being patient will really help you to get that advantage, but it takes time. That's why patience is so important. You have to remember, when you're doing all of these things, when you're freezing the lane, and when you're trying to poke the enemy and keep them low, and when you're trying to do all the different things that you can to catch up to them in gold, you need to remember it takes time. So be patient. Don't engage in fights that you're not ready for. Farm up as much as you can so you can catch up. And when you're ready, start engaging in the fights with them so you can try and take them down. Now, my last bit of advice in this section that I want to leave you with is to not put on your blinders and go tunnel vision when you're trying to farm up. So many guys, either because they're grumpy or they're upset about their situation they're in, or because they're trying so hard to catch up, they'll put on blinders to the entire game, and all they'll do is stay in lane, freeze the lane, take as many minions as they can, push it up, go back to tower, buy another card over and over and over and over. But what they'll do is they'll neglect the rest of the team. They'll neglect the fact that the rest of their team is now starting to fall behind, because the person that you were versing in lane is rotating all the time, but you're not. And so it's always a 5v4 situation. So you want to make sure that, yes, you are farming and you're being careful and patient, but that you're not putting your blinders up to your team and you're still going and helping them as much as you can. Okay, now we're going to take a really brief look at some basics and intro to counter building your enemy. Counter building is probably the number one way to contain an enemy that is getting ahead. We've all seen it. And it doesn't really matter which hero it is. It happens. It can happen with any one of them if a player is playing good enough or they've had enough luck to get ahead. So let's say it's a Kalari, which is probably the most annoying situation. You're playing against a Kalari who's got, 6 kills and no deaths, and they've got a bunch of farm already, and they're just picking on you over and over and over and over again, and they're wrecking your team at every turn. Instead of just getting upset and wanting to surrender because this one good player on an enemy team of average people is getting ahead, instead of wanting to quit, encourage your team to counter build them. If they have a bunch of lifesteal, counter it with anti-heal. If they've got a bunch of armor or a bunch of protections or whatever, or they're doing a bunch of penetration, build things that slow them down and reduce the advantage that they have. If you're playing against an enemy hero that's super tanky and you can't kill them, counter build it. If they're building a bunch of physical armor and you are a physical attacker, use physical penetration. Build physical penetration and you will break through their armor inevitably. And eventually, when your team starts to catch up to them because you're counter building them, you'll contain them. So many people pay attention to trying to get kills and trying to get their farm, but they neglect the build that they're building. And they end up just doing a recommended build or something basic. So that's why I also want to encourage when it comes to building that before you jump into games, you take a good look at the different cards Predecessor has to offer. Now, there's quite a few of them, and there's probably going to be more and more as the game progresses. But if you can get a general idea of what all the different cards do, you can build throughout the game to counter your enemy. Another part of counter building you really want to pay attention to is knowing what the laner you are against naturally has. For example, and I just saw this the other night, it was something we had to counter. We were up against a Narbash, and me and my carry were trying to take out him and the Murdoch, but we were having a really hard time because the Narbash had this insane amount of healing going on. So no matter how much damage we did, they were healing past it, even though we had way more farm than them. So what we inevitably had to do was build anti-heal. And all I had to do was build one card, and that Narbash's healing became almost obsolete. And we were able to counter him and get the advantage and ultimately win that game. So it's really important that you know what the natural abilities of your opponents are. If you know that the opponent you're against has a natural ability for magical damage, counter it with magical armor. If you know that they are a very tanky hero and you do a certain kind of damage, counter the tankiness with penetration. It's always, always, always possible to catch up to the enemy, and it's always possible to counter the enemy. That's why it's so important that you are engaged in every game, paying attention to what the enemy is building, to what their natural abilities are, respecting the enemy, and also making sure that you take time to farm up, yet help your team at the same time. Okay, that's going to do it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you guys have any suggestions on videos you want to see in the future, feel free to leave me a comment. It would be nice if you'd leave me a like and a subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the battlefield. Peace.
Thing